What is postmodernity? So postmodernity to us, our practice, relative to the cultural context we find ourselves in, is what we've been thinking about. And I guess we think we're in an era where architectural culture is undefined in the sense that there are no predominant movements. And the world and society that we're currently practicing within is much more postmodern as a general base level of cultural activity than when postmodernism was emerging and proposing itself as an alternative to modernism. We're the product of a modernist education. We spent years retroactively looking for reasons to underwrite design decisions, never quite comfortable with the fact, just declaring that we of course allow space for a level of willful composition. Our modernist education poked fun at postmodernism as inauthentic and lacking relevance, looking backward without full acknowledgement of contemporary requirements and opportunities. Meanwhile, society seemed more generally quite comfortable by its nostalgic familiarity. We know we're not modernists. We can't subscribe to a school of thought that seems so constrained, not that the first generation of modernists felt those constraints. Our architecture isn't defined by a set of clear and questionable linear decisions. So after many years and thinking about doing this talk today, I found myself pulling down my Charles Jenks book from the bookshelf to kind of think about what it really meant relative to us. His expression late modern still covers an awful lot of contemporary practice, much of which is quite uninspiring. Modern cities are full of new architect designed, but workaday buildings that do little to connect or enhance with the city they find. And then I found two statements that did describe us: modern, but looking backwards and sideways, and postmodern refers to those that have a more complex relation to tradition and communication. So maybe we are postmodern after all. In our contemporary unconstrained society, postmodern culture has become the mainstream, perhaps. We've got complete liberty, but it's a different version of postmodernism than that first generation. Instead, we're part of a generation looking for an architecture with meaning that allows us to demonstrate that we're moving forwards with a knowledge of and respect for established building cultures. And it's not just in the design of the building, but in the placing of that building, and with a care for a public realm that is also rooted in history and tradition. And I think there are many reasons that we're looking to make these connections with history, from reassuring and reconnecting with society to show that architects can be trusted after the alleged failure of the modern project, at least in the eyes of the general public. And also having witnessed a generation or two of buildings made with insubstantial materials that are aging quite badly. Which figure from the first generation of postmodernists do you consider particularly relevant to your own work? Perhaps, obviously, I'd say James Stirling. We've always enjoyed the subversive architects of each generation, those that work at the edge of a language, distorting and bending the rules. Hawksmoor or Lutyens would also be on our list. And that's the territory that most interests us. Many of that first generation had a modernist prehistory before perhaps moving towards postmodernism. And we've now got the benefit of looking back across evolving careers and being able to appreciate how their work reacted to changing cultural conditions of their time. Whatever the conditions for his career, Stirling reacted and led with immense capability, skill, and importantly, a knowing kind of wit. Prior to what we may now recognize as his postmodern period, there was always a rule-breaking relationship with modernism. It was always post or beyond modernism in that respect. And Stirling was in charge of all scales, a kind of master of decision-making at all scales of the discipline, articulate plans that accommodate a kind of meandering narrative with an underlying order, through to subversive construction detailing that revealed the subterfuge. Visually heavy stone buildings revealed in a number of ways as thin, high-performance technical solutions, as if mocking his own nonsensical pursuit of something unattainable within contemporary constraints. What role does architectural history play in shaping your work? We don't possess a deep and thorough understanding of the history of architecture. We're not academics. We're eclectic with a passing understanding of many things. We see architectural history as a resource, but that also includes the recent history and sometimes a very recent history of buildings or images of buildings that we've seen. In a quite direct way, practical way, we're often working in conservation areas where there's even more scrutiny. And the idea of situating a project by making immediate connections to the historic setting of a project, reappropriating the found, sits alongside drawing from a much wider architectural history. The first generation were working predominantly with quotations of classicism, it seems. We find ourselves a few decades down the line and we're connecting with multiple languages and styles. In the last few years, we've been referring to this in our office, but also in our teaching studio at Kingston School of Art as a kind of bad language, an architectural language formed of multiple sources. We want it all. We're impure. We're interested in a multiple sourced architecture. In one project, there might be a fragment of the house next door, a fragment of a Danish art gallery, a Palladian villa, or a Mysian tower. And it's often an accidental kind of referencing. We find ideas creeping into our projects before we can really see, let alone acknowledge their source. It's often not until we reflect on the project that we see the connections. Working in this way requires you to work towards a careful synthesis. It isn't reckless sampling that doesn't hang together, at least we hope it isn't. It's the difficult whole that Venturi refers to. How does your approach to history differ from that of the first generation of postmodernists? To us, the first generation was more academic. Their collaged quotations were serious, perhaps to set their manifesto more starkly against modernism. And as I said, they're working predominantly with quotations of classicism. We find ourselves in a generation that works much more comfortably with the as found, often with quite mundane references as a starting point. There was an in-between generation with Tony Fretton at its centre that explored a relationship with the everyday. Their work unlocked the acceptance of the normal and revelled in it. It opened our eyes to a way of working with the seemingly ordinary. We talk quite a lot with our students about finding the extraordinary within the ordinary. It's just a way of seeing or learning to see. We show them things like Stephen Shaw photographs where an everyday backstreet becomes a kind of composition of remarkable intrigue. So our references or quotations are perhaps less pompous than that first generation. We're not at all anxious about the potentially lowbrow cultural references being visible. We feel no shame in the ordinariness of things. But very consciously, we steer clear of the ironic use of references, which was sometimes employed by the first generation. Instead, we enjoy ambiguity, double readings of adopted tropes. For example, an arched door like every other house in the street, that's actually just a window and it is blocked at the ground level, and the door is hidden adjacent in the shadows. Or a canopy that shelters a new front door that out of the corner of the eye appears to be just part of the continuing pattern of neighbouring stoops established on the rest of the street. And how we make things, I think, is different from that first generation. This was not always done that well, as they balanced their desires for tradition with contemporary modern technical requirements. So making has become very important to us. And it might be a slight hang-up of our kind of modernist education, a truth to construction with an honesty to materials. We're interested in the idea of a kind of Ruskinian decoration of construction, as opposed to the more willful act of constructing decoration. And sometimes that decoration is really just an elaboration and an articulation of how something is made. At Red House, we decided we wanted a concrete arch. We wanted the arch to perform structurally. So it was made out of a large concrete panel, and we pressed the pattern into the panel to kind of reveal the fact that it was a concrete mass that was lodged in the front of the building. What is the role of figuration in your work? It's central to our current work, but it's not something we could have seen or probably admitted to only 10 years ago with our uptight modernist background. Good buildings are not just a plan, meeting the edges of the site and pretending to be just a kind of functional expression of their use and arrangement. We do place great importance on the external appearance of buildings, their face to the city. This is the aspect of the building that's most impactful to most amount of people. We hope we don't neglect other aspects of making good buildings, but we acknowledge that their image in the city is how most people will experience them. And our architectural language and meaning is drawn from within architecture itself, the articulation of building elements or recognizable motifs reinterpreted. And also, because of the scale we work at, we draw character perhaps primarily from figuration and composition. The scale of our projects couldn't achieve character through strong repetition or sophisticated material systems, for instance. And finally, an appreciation of figuration is perhaps massively accentuated by the current obsession of the image through social media and the kind of rapid dispersal of new projects. We participate in that and we enjoy it, but I think we're quite careful to, especially in our teaching studio, to point out that it's not a way to understand buildings. What makes postmodernity relevant in current times? I think it's much less the body of work that was produced that is left behind, whilst I hope that that will be cherished and protected. What seems to be more relevant is the discussion around postmodernism, a critical engagement with history alongside a critical disciplinary discussion around some of the tropes and techniques that seem prevalent amongst a group of architects at the moment, a global group of architects. I think these techniques unlock a number of potentials. So firstly, and sadly, I think we're still working on repairing this sort of societal mistrust of architects founded on poor versions of modernism and their subsequent failures. Of course, many of those projects were prematurely and unfairly condemned through perhaps mainly political decisions. In Britain, we work in a context of preservation and a general comfort with the familiar. And when we present projects at planning meetings, we await the inevitable use of the words in keeping. So when we first started out in practice, we were anxious to achieve planning consents on behalf of our clients, but anxious to ensure that buildings got built to demonstrate our competence. So we relied upon narrative very heavily to carry clients and planning officers along with detailed stories about connections being made in the projects, why they were like they were. And now we see that strategy as an advantage. We're interested in legible connections at a level which is evident to all. So we include quite obvious hooks that allow anyone to access an idea, to begin to understand the buildings that we propose and make a connection with their own house, their own street or their town. Those ideas are then supplemented by additional layers that we hope allow a slower reading of the buildings that we make. We don't much care for the kind of postmodern one-liner and hope instead for kind of layered readings that mean buildings have a lasting presence and value. And we consider that now as a kind of inclusive, accessible kind of architecture. It is not solely architecture for architects that we're interested in. At a larger scale, we don't believe a good city is made of iconic buildings, each vying for attention, or buildings that have their own inaccessible, selfish, intellectual logic. To make a coherent city requires an enormous amount of collective endeavor, a certain amount of modesty, and an effort to create connection and a sense of belonging. We work in more piecemeal times, weaving projects into the existing city fabric. I'd refer back to the idea that perhaps these connections are a method to repair a societal mistrust, a society that finds architects and their ideas disconnected from reality and their sense of comfort. So we work hard to show that we care. Thank you. We're definitely postmodern. And there, we've finally said it.